So, today we are going to continue our series going through the minor prophets. We're coming down to the end. There's not too many left. So, I got some rumblings of ideas of what we're going to do next. So, we got some stuff brewing. But today we are going to finish up talking about Zechariah. Now, if you recall, last week we looked at the first part of the book, which is sometimes referred to as First Zechariah. So now we're going to look at the second half of the book, sometimes called Second Zechariah. If you recall, the first part of the book dates to about the 6th century. It deals with the main characters of the priest Joshua and the governor Zerubbabel. And it's focused mostly on the restoration of Jerusalem. Both, if you recall, in the immediate sense of their immediate return to the land, setting up the government, setting up the walls, all of that, but also in an apocalyptic sense, looking kind of toward the end, looking at the ultimate restoration of Jerusalem at the end of all things. And so we're going to dive into Second Zechariah, which shifts tone and a lot shifts kind of when you're looking at this book. So first thing to know is to try to date this book is really hard. Because this part of the book is really a grab bag of quotes and references to specific people, traditions, works, and honestly, it comes off like, so I used to teach, this person would get flagged for plagiarism so hard. Because it is just, they grabbed things from a bunch of locations and just kind of dumped them into a pot. So trying to date it exactly is hard. So some examples. There's parts of this book that align with Amos. It refers to the Assyrian Empire, the northern kingdom of Israel in the present tense as if they're still there, talking about when this happens to them, when this, even though in theory they've been gone for quite a while. And then later, it references the Greek city-state of Iona, which doesn't fully rise to power until the Hellenistic period, quite a ways down. So when does this book fit? Iona is referenced in Ezekiel, and at this time we know it is around, but it's kind of a smaller area. So most scholars tend to kind of throw all of this together and give a generic range somewhere in the 5th century to just try to cover all bases. So it could be any time from 10, 20, 30 years after the first part of the book to 100 years after the first part of the book. So just kind of keep that in your head as we kind of walk through some of the stuff that goes on here. Like just from an academic standpoint, this book is a nightmare to wade through because you clearly see like you took these 3 verses from here, this comes from over here, you didn't add a transition in here, it's fun. So what is the kind of structure of the second half of the book? Well, it is 2 large oracles that kind of come together to have this main idea of talking about the coming day of the Lord. But these 2 are linked kind of interestingly. So both chapters 9 and 12, the beginning of each oracle, starts the exact same. An oracle, a word of the Lord against, and then goes on to talk about who it's against. Now that seems pretty normal. Except that first phrase there, an oracle. The word that's used is not the normal word we use for oracle. Rather, what's used is this word, masah, which most woodenly translates burden. So this is a verb that when you talk about like a beast of burden, it would be this. Or you talk about to pick up and carry something, it's a burdensome, it'd be this. So these 2 places, and weirdly enough, the beginning of Malachi are some of the only places where this specific word is used to talk about an oracle. So some translations will actually translate this, the burden I received of word of the Lord against. So it sets these 2, and then we get to Malachi, kind of apart and separate as being very unique. There are scholars that can go into, like, is there a direct link between Malachi and this? We don't know. But all of that to mean these 2 are very unique in what kind of their structure and how they're set up. So what are they saying? The first oracle, as we talked about, is from chapters 9 to 11, and it describes how God is going to defeat the neighbors of Israel. How the people that have oppressed Israel ratted them out to the Assyrians, gone to war against them, looted their temples and everything, how they will fall. And how all the people that are exiled will come home. Now, that may seem weird kind of in the context of this book, because in theory, they've already been returned home. This is post-exile. So remember, this book is really starting that first idea of the apocalyptic literature, the idea of this kind of ultimate return to Israel in the highest level, the highest sense. And then the narrative shifts a little bit in chapter 11. We get basically a parable, a story about a flock and a shepherd who was leading this flock that apparently did so bad a job that when the new shepherd comes over, who is God in the story, the sheep are so corrupted to the point they don't listen and don't do anything. The good shepherd cannot do anything with them. And so this is God's way of saying, we had this really great plan laid out. Do you remember the plan that we had laid out in the first part of this book, where you had Joshua set up, you had Zerubbabel set up? They kind of dropped the ball. They were such bad leaders and so corrupt that I don't know if this plan could happen anymore. To the point that this section ends with this kind of dramatic pronouncement. Oh, my worthless shepherd, who deserts the flock, may the sword strike his arm and his right eye. Let his arm be completely withered and his right eye utterly blind. This is big condemnation coming down of, you were so bad of a leader, you derailed the plan of God. That's a kind of jump from the first part of the book, where they're so excited to have this group of people leading them. Okay, that is not a great start to this oracle, to this kind of section of the book. But it does soften a little bit when we get to the second oracle. The second oracle is from chapters 12 to the end of the book, 14. And this part of the book is mostly concerned with restoring Jerusalem in an apocalyptic setting, restoring Jerusalem at the end of time. And it uses some cool analogies to do this. So it talks about Jerusalem as kind of the center of the world in a land that never has night. It is always brightness. The brightness of the Lord is always present in this land. And it talks about living water coming from the mountain of God. Pull that passage up. So this is chapter 14, verse 8. On that day, living waters will flow from Jerusalem, half of them to the eastern sea and half of them to the western sea. It shall continue in the summer as in the winter. Now, the phrase living water, we think of a lot associated with Jesus, right? Like, it's a phrase that's happened a lot. But Jesus didn't invent this phrase. It was a phrase that was super, super common in the ancient Near East. Now, on a very practical level, living water just means running water. So water that can't get stale, can't get stagnant, which would be a huge deal, because a lot of times you could find a pool of water. You would come feed your sheep in it. It was stagnant. There was stuff in it. Your sheep are now dead. But if it's flowing, there's much less of a chance of that happening. So the idea of a king bringing living water to people was a massive, huge accomplishment. That was something that they kind of prided themselves in doing. And this is even go far as to saying, we're getting living water in the summer, when we normally do it, but also in the winter. So like, there is always continual water. It is a land of plenty. And then on the symbolic side, the idea of living water, it represents purity, it represents life. Because water, the essence of life, so if you have clean, pure water, the land is pure, the land is full of life, the land is fertile, lush, all of that good things. So I think it's just interesting that we take this very common analogy, we see this idea here of this kind of apocalyptic, this will happen, this living water will flow out. Little do we kind of realize here that living water is talking about Jesus. Like, that's the living water that's coming, that fits into this analogy, or this vision here. The other part about the second proclamation, or the second vision, is we get this cool idea here. This is verse 14, chapter 14, verse 16. Then all who survive the nations that have come against Jerusalem, they shall go up after 1 year, worship the King, the Lord of hosts, to keep the festival of booths. So what this is, everyone who has been against Israel, been against God, been against the people, they're going to be defeated, but they're not going to be destroyed. They're going to come together and basically repent and come as one nation and celebrate the festival of booths. Does anyone know what the festival of booths is? Yep. So sometimes it's called Sukkot. And it's the annual celebration of God's protection and provision of the people when they leave Egypt and they're wandering in the wilderness, when they don't have anything. A lot of times during this festival, they will set up a kind of temporary dwelling. You'll eat there, spend as much time as possible there. Just kind of to continually remind you of the provision God provided the people when they were at their lowest. They were freed, but how were they to take care of themselves? And it remembers that. It remembers God's provision. So think about the symbolism here with this festival. You have a festival that currently, then, and still today, is reminding people of God's provision, God's guidance in a very wilderness low time. So if we take this to this apocalyptic setting, this would be after what we would call the world's largest diaspora, right? Diaspora is when people are spread all over the world. So if we're talking about this kind of revelation, end of all time, coming together, it is all the nations, all the children of God, all the family of God returning together, reflecting on how the provision of God got us to this point. It's turning this festival that is very localized into this magnified idea, moving it to this huge level of, we've made it, we're home, we're together celebrating. Let's think about how we got here. Look back at all the great things God did for us on our way here. And so I just love this kind of image of taking this current festival and turning it into such a almost apocalyptic, but in a good way, like celebration of all that God has done. Now, the last line of this book has caused some issues. It's weird when you first read it. So this is kind of the very end. We read, there shall no longer be a Canaanite in the house of the Lord of hosts on that day. Now, there's a couple ways this has been taken. In a very literal sense, you could take it at the time of, well, there was major issues with the people kind of going out, bringing outside cultures in, belief in other gods in, especially the Canaanites. So is this what they're talking about? Very literally, there will be no Canaanites in at this celebration, at the end of all time celebration. Or most people lean toward this metaphorically. And again, can be taken two ways. So Canaanites represented kind of the ultimate enemy of Israel. Even more so than the Babylonians, the Assyrians, all of them, Canaanites were always pitted against, you are the bad guys. You're the ones that are always opposing us. You're the ones that are always trying to tear down the temple of God. You're the ones that are always trying to put your God in place of ours. So, some take this to be the Canaanite as the ultimate oppressor, the ultimate kind of villain, the ultimate one that opposes God will not be there. And some translations will try to get that intent across by changing it a little bit. Some translations will say, and there shall no longer be traitors in the house of the Lord, on the host of that day. So it's trying to get at the idea of, it's not specifically the Canaanites themselves, it's those who turn their back on God. Those who actively work against God will not be there. And I think this is a good kind of reminder and note that what translation you use can matter, because the people that do the translations put some interpretation into it. In this case, I would argue this is kind of the right interpretation to take of it, but it is still a change that is made. Because before translations did things like this, put traitors in there, it was taken as no outsider will be allowed in. And that's a whole thing that is not meant in kind of this idea of no Canaanite in. It seems very clear from context. It's talking about those who oppose God, those who work against God, not cultural or ethnic outsiders. So that's why a lot of translations will make this change to traders. But I just wanted to be aware, it can be a big thing when translations change keywords to try to get a point across, but we want to know kind of why why they made that decision, what was the thought that went into it, all of that. So that's my little soapbox on that. Now, it's question time.